All right, I think we'll get this started. My name is Derek Dysart. One of the people that kind of put this together. I got with me Mike Cogden. I actually work here at Hanson Dodge Creative. Mike is at Verndale, and Nick, who is in the back, who will be presenting later, kind of had the idea to put together a meetup for Sitecore developers in the Milwaukee area. There's quite a few folks that we all know, and kind of everyone, our network of folks kind of knew quite a few people that do Sitecore development, and we thought it'd be good to get a regular meetup together just to get folks together, share ideas. Nick's going to go over some cool stuff on stuff that's coming out with Sitecore 7.5 and what are they calling it? The XD. Experience database. Yeah, the experience database. So basically the MongoDB backend for analytics. So without anything else, you should know this is being recorded, so you can come back and watch it later. We're screen sharing the screen here, and then we've got kind of a little webcam so people can see what's going on up here as well. So if you want to go back and reference something, this will be available. And we do have a few people watching remotely as well. So, yeah, I guess that Sitecore's asked us to kind of have right of first refusal for taking it down. So, I guess we'll ask for forgiveness before permission. So, Mike, do you want to add anything? No. Do we thank Dion and Verndale for refreshments? Yeah. So the pizza you guys are enjoying was provided by Xeon, and refreshments were provided by Verndale. So. I'll give them a hand for providing some. Yeah, housekeeping. Bathrooms are in back if you haven't found them. They're basically through the door you came in, just past that to the left there. And I'm trying to think of, that should be it. I'll turn it over to Nick.
Awesome. Thank you all for being here. Did we mention anything about the fabulous prizes? So we do have some swag that Sitecore provided for the meeting, and at the end there are some comment cards over by the spotted cow. So if you want to fill one of those out, we'll throw them all in a box at the end and draw some names. And there are Sitecore pads and pens over there if you guys want to grab any of those too. Feel free. So as I start to look like Bono here, can you all still hear me? I'm missing the sunglasses. But so thanks everyone for coming. And tonight our first topic for the Milwaukee Sitecore Developers Meetup is going to be Sitecore 7.5 and the experience database. So Sitecore did a quick overview of this for partners, I think, about 3 weeks ago, and also released a preview version to Sitecore MVPs, and they're doing what they call lighthouse testing with some customers right now. So based on that availability, we at Active Commerce have been able to do a little bit of prototyping and exploration of 7.5. So I'm going to share with you tonight all the cool stuff we've found out about 7.5. So I'll go over kind of what's new in Sitecore 7.5, and the two big things there are, first off, the contact record, which is a new kind of entity in the Sitecore Analytics database, and that's also known as the experience profile. And then we'll talk about the new databases and data flow of analytics in Sitecore 7.5. And since MongoDB is going to be coming up quite a bit, and that's a technology that probably most of us haven't spent a lot of time with, Mike Forcey from Hanson Dodge, who is a certified MongoDB database administrator, is that right? Is going to come up and tell us why MongoDB isn't scary. And then we'll talk a little bit about running Sitecore 7.5 on-premise versus in Sitecore's new cloud service offering for analytics. And then we'll finish out with some code, which is hopefully why most of you are here, about showing how you can actually use and extend analytics in Sitecore 7.5. So a few housekeeping items of my own first. First off, this is based on a preview release. 7.5 is not available yet. I believe it will be released in July. I think the cloud offering in August. So features, APIs, and other details are subject to change. And my get out of jail free card on the demos breaking is that this is experimental software, so the demos may not be 100% functional. And also, pardon the buzzwords, we're going to be talking about big data, we're going to be talking about the cloud, and I'll try to keep those phrases to a minimum for you guys, since, again, I think most of y'all are developers. And you know that the cloud really is just the internet. So the other thing to note is that there are going to be some product name changes in Sitecore 7.5. What we used to call CEP, the Customer Engagement Platform, is now going to be called the Sitecore Experience Platform, Sitecore CMS, Experience CMS, and on down through Experience Marketing for Digital Marketing System. Email Campaign Manager becomes the Email Experience Manager. Engagement Analytics become Experience Analytics. Adaptive Print Studio is Print Experience Manager, and Engagement Automation is Experience Automation. Anyone notice a pattern? Obviously it's all about the customer experience now in Sitecore 7.5, and that may or may not be related to some of their competitive products. So let's talk about specifically what is new in Sitecore 7.5. But first, to have some context for that, we're going to talk a little bit about Sitecore DMS as it is today. So first off, how many people are running DMS on a website right now, either their own or a customer? Not too many hands, and that's part of, I think, the reasoning behind Sitecore 7.5. How many people know what DMS is? How about that? All right, that's cool. So the kind of things you're going to see that you see in the digital marketing system database are visitors, visits, page views, events, a lot like you would find in Google Analytics, marketing campaigns, user profiles, so the ability to profile your content and then increment scores around different profiles based on that user's browsing behavior, GeoIP data. So Sitecore uses MaxMind to do a lookup and store the GeoIP data for a visit, and then engagement automation as well. So if you aren't familiar with the marketing automation tool, the idea is that you can actually push users through different states of marketing plans and do automated emails and other activities as they go through that marketing plan. So this is what's in DMS today. Some of the shortcomings of DMS as it exists is, first off, a visitor is really a cookie. If I clear my cookies in my browser, Sitecore thinks I'm a new visitor. So really, I'm not being tracked as the same customer anymore in the DMS database. I'm looked at as a new person. I'm reaccumulating my profile scores, and the same goes if I access the site from my mobile phone, or if I access the site at home and at work. So at that point, DMS sees me as a different person. So kind of a bit of a shortcoming in the data model there when you're really looking to track that customer across all the touch points. It's also a lot of data, especially on any kind of high traffic site. You have to really tune that SQL server. Sitecore actually recommends that you run analytics on a different SQL server than you're running the other Sitecore databases, and I'm guessing not many of us are doing that or have experience doing that. And if you don't tune that, it can slow down the performance of your site significantly just based on the analytics data collection alone. So there are settings in DMS to actually turn down the amount of data it collects so that it's not collecting everything that it hits. But then, of course, you're losing a lot of the value of it. You're not actually tracking all the analytics, and you're losing the ability to view that user's page history when they come back to the site. For similar reasons, it's difficult to collect data in distributed architectures. So if you're running data centers across continents and you want to collect all that analytics data into one place, there's really nothing in DMS today to easily pull all that data into a single database. You're really collecting it in geographically distributed areas. And even if you can pull all that data together, if I happen to switch data centers for whatever reason on my next visit, I'm not necessarily going to have all the data from my previous visits in that local analytics database. It's also difficult to extend the collected data. So if you want to start running your own reports or collecting additional analytics that are specific to your business. There's not a lot built in. There aren't easy ways in the existing analytics data model to do that in SQL Server. So Sitecore 7.5 is really meant to overcome a lot of these shortcomings in analytics. So you're not going to see a whole lot new in Sitecore 7.5 for the CMS or search APIs or anything like that. Really, Sitecore 7.5 is going to be Sitecore 7.2 plus the experience database. So it's really all about the analytics. So xDB is shorthand for experience database. We'll be talking about that a lot tonight. And one of the biggest additions in the data model in the experience database is the concept of a contact. And a contact is that sort of aggregation of visitors. So in other words, it's me, but it's not just me on my desktop. It's me on my mobile phone. It's me visiting from work. It's me after I clear my cookies. Now, how that gets done is a little tricky, obviously, because I don't have the same cookies, but we'll talk about that. And then there's a new, more scalable analytics data architecture as well. And that kind of gets split into a session database with what are called private and shared sessions that we'll talk about. Collection database, which is really the xDB itself. And then a reporting database that kind of aggregates data and where we can actually run our fancy executive reports. So let's talk first a little about the experience profile or the contact. So again, the idea is to track a user across multiple visits, across sessions, across devices. And it actually allows you to share data in session between my visits from multiple devices simultaneously. And we'll see an example of that later. But the real key here is that it requires some sort of a mechanism for identifying me as a contact. At some point, I need to let you know who I am. Otherwise, there's no way for Sitecore to make that association between my visits. So this could be through a login, obviously, a form submission with my email address on it, or an e-commerce checkout where I need to supply my email address. And this is where we all get creeped out because Amazon is already doing this to us, but now we can do it to everyone ourselves. Or you know, our marketing teams can tell us to do it for them. So all that contact data is aggregated into a report, and that's known as the experience profile, and that's actually a new interface you can log into in Sitecore and see all the details on a particular contact. We'll take a look at that. So for short, Sitecore is calling the experience profile the X file, which at least it's not another acronym. So the experience profile is going to contain all kinds of data about a person as you collect it. Again, you need some sort of unique key, and you can actually have multiple identifiers that signify who the person is, but I think for the most part, we're always going to be using email address for that, unless you have another way of identifying a person. So as you collect different data on the user, you can store things like phone numbers, addresses. It's going to collect all the visits that person has made to the site. Obviously, if you can get a picture of them, that's great. If you're collecting any profile data in DMS, so if you're tagging your content based on particular personas and the user is browsing that content and Sitecore is incrementing those keys, then that data will also appear within the experience profile. And then you can even get down to the point of exploring individual visits the user made to the site and the pages they looked at and the goals or events that they triggered during that visit. Now the actual value of this report I think is frankly somewhat questionable for a typical website, right? I mean, how often are you going to log in and look at an individual user who has logged into your site? But I think first off, it's meant to show the power of this tool, right? If you have this data accessible in a report, it's also available programmatically for you to do personalization or to push the user through marketing automation or what have you. In B2B scenarios, I think it could obviously be useful, and potentially in customer support scenarios. If for example, if you're running customer service for a e-commerce website, you can actually log in and see what did this user do to get into this situation. But again, I think in the end, the real idea is that we're showing what's possible now that we have a single view of a customer within the Sitecore Analytics database. So to support this in a massive site that's globally distributed, Sitecore has introduced a new data architecture for analytics. So we can no longer get away with just running a single SQL Server database alongside the web core and master databases in Sitecore. So the basic idea here is that first off, the analytics data is first going to be stored in the user's session. So currently in analytics, every page hit is put into a queue, and based on some thresholds, Sitecore then pushes that data into the database. In order to, I guess, make that a little less chatty and to be able to support globally distributed data collection, it happens now on session end. So when the user's session is over, that data about the contact and about the user's page hits and so on gets flushed into the collection database, otherwise known as the experience database. But now the experience database is also, as we'll see, a Mongo database optimized for data collection. It's not really optimized for reporting. So to get those fancy executive insight dashboard reports and other reports, there's also now a new data processing service that's going to aggregate that data into a separate reporting database. Excuse me. That's still good old-fashioned SQL Server. So talk in detail a little bit about these three different databases. The session database is actually just kind of what we're all used to with ASP.NET Session. At least the private session is. And this is where Sitecore is going to be storing the visit information. So what am I actually doing when I'm interacting with the site? What are the page hits? What are the page events? And so on. There's also now the concept of a shared session. And the idea is that this can actually be accessed across devices. So if I'm on the website and I need to run out and I jump in on my phone and that phone knows, or that site knows who I am on both devices, then I can pick up my session where I left off, whether it be a shopping cart or other interactions on my phone. And I think by default the shared session is actually set to expire 1 minute after the private session. So this is where Sitecore actually stores my contact information. So you actually don't need to run a separate session database on a simple site if you don't want to. You can continue to use standard ASP.NET in-proc sessions. But the problem is, because that analytics data is being stored in there, if the server goes down, if the application pool recycles, or whatever, you're losing that analytics data right there. So you can use the Sitecore Analytics will support any session provider that supports the session end event. The problem there is that the built-in ASP.NET SQL Session Store doesn't actually support session end. So Sitecore actually provides two alternate session store providers. The first is one based on MongoDB, and the second is kind of an enhanced SQL Server session store that both support the session end event. So again, it's that session end event that's needed to flush the data to the collection database. So the collection database, whereas the session database can be either Mongo or SQL Server, the collection database does need to be MongoDB. And the idea here is that it's going to allow scaling, massive scaling and massive hosting of big data. But really, I think Mike, when he gets up here to talk about Mongo, you'll kind of get an idea of why Mongo is so scalable. And it is a database platform database, the report UIs can still be available. So basically, Sitecore has you run 2 copies of the same database side by side so that you can rebuild that database without making the reports inaccessible. So to kind of take you guys end to end of what we just walked through, the basic idea of analytics data flow. So here we have a diagram of probably 2 data centers, let's say across continents, with a load balancer at each and 2 content delivery servers at each, and then a centralized reporting database, either at another data center or, as we'll see, in the cloud hosted with Sitecore. So first off, the user is directed to a data center by DNS. The user does need to go to a particular data center and have stickiness there because that's where the session server is. So usually you do this through some fancy Cisco equipment for global load balancing through DNS, or maybe you just have localized URLs for your site that point to different data centers. And the load balancer is going to direct the request to a particular server because ideally you're not using in-proc sessions now. You're using one of the 2 session providers. You don't need to enable sticky sessions. So the user can freely move between the servers and you can get a better balance of resource utilization between your CD servers. Any user interactions at that point, the page views, the events, and so on, are going to get stored in that private session in the session database. And then the contact data is going to get stored in the shared session within the same database. Again, on session end, that data is going to get flushed to the collection database. And then the processing service is going to pick up that change and start to process that new data and aggregate it into the reporting database. And then our reports are going to read from the collection and reporting databases. So things are a lot more complicated now with analytics, obviously. You're no longer, again, you no longer have that single SQL server anymore. But before we talk about how Sitecore can make that easier for you, Mr. Mike Forcey is going to talk to us about why using MongoDB here really isn't that scary, and give us a little introduction to Mongo. You good to run the slides?
All right, so I'll give you guys an overview of MongoDB, why you might use it, how to set it up, and some simple examples. Like Nick said, it's not scary. It's easy to use, but also only if you're using it for the right situation. The data that Nick referenced before, you see that things are stored in documents rather than tables, or rows, that is. So you have collections of documents rather than tables of rows. There's no such thing as a join in Mongo. Instead, you can have arrays or subdocuments. And if your data is highly relational, you can still use it to store the keys in your documents, but then you're going to have to do 2 queries to load the first one and then load the keys. So really, the idea is here, if you can model your data for atomic operations, where if your relationships are restricted to a single document, then you can make an update to one document and keep all the fields in sync. The scaling that Nick talked about, Mongo is designed to scale horizontally instead of vertically. So instead of needing a powerful server, it's designed to run on commodity hardware, speed over wide area networks. If you have a cluster, you basically scale 2 ways. Sharding is partitioning. You shard based on a key, and it'll divide your data onto a separate instance by that key, and then if you query by that key, it'll only read from the necessary partition, making it faster. Replication through replica sets, backing up the data, allows for read preference by location, and ease of development. The drivers and the tools make it really easy to use. The data is actually stored in BSON, which is binary JSON. It's designed for fast scannability and to skip unnecessary fields when you're querying. It allows you to use the regular JSON data types as well as a date or a binary And object ID is a field that's in every document. If you don't specify it, is underscore ID, and that'll be generated as an object ID. The client application drivers automatically handle translating from your objects to a BSON query and then returning BSON and translating it back into your objects. The examples I show are installing this on Windows. It's actually easier on Linux, but if you're going to do it on Windows, the first thing you need to do is install a hotfix that fixes an issue with memory mapped files, and then download the binary distributions from Mongo. The 32-bit versions don't allow you to have any databases greater than 2 gigabytes, so they're not intended for use in production. Once you download the binaries, the first thing you want to do is make a location for your log files, create a configuration file with that path, create a path where the data is stored. The default is cdatadb. You can change it and put it in your config file, but whatever you choose has to exist, otherwise you won't be able to start the process. If you want to create as a Windows service so it automatically starts when you reboot, that's usually a good idea. The Mongo shell, when you download the binaries, there are a few executables in there. Mongo.exe is the shell. Allows you to interact with the database using JavaScript. So when you type in Mongo, you can specify a host and a port, authentication information. By default, authentication is turned off. So if you just type in Mongo, it's going to connect to the local host on the default port of 27017. And then it says connecting to test, that's a database. Even though that database doesn't exist, this kind of goes into the flexible dynamic schemas. There are a lot of commands you can type in that are built into the shell, helper commands that execute JavaScript that they have stored. So show DBs shows the databases that are on there. Admin is where your user information would be stored. Insert is a helper method. You can just directly type in JSON and insert it. The collection doesn't have to exist before you do that. You can put in any field names, any data types. The same collection can have documents with different fields or different data types for the same field. You can see after I inserted something, now the test database has data. If you type in use database name to switch, show collections would show what you actually have in there. Find is a helper method that just displays everything. And any helper method, if you type in the name without the parentheses, it'll show you the JavaScript that's actually being executed, so you can see what parameters go in there. Also, typing in help gives you all these options, and then more specifically, if you're in a database, db.help will show you commands specific to the database, or a collection help will show you everything you can do on the collection. Getting data in, there are a few ways you can do it. If you have just a text file that has JSON in it, you can run this import, specify what database and collection you want it to go in. It'll tell you how many came in, and after doing that, you can see that some are in there. This is just some, not Sitecore data, just sample data from Mongo. Also, backup and restore is called dump and restore. So when you're connected to the server, and if you just do a dump, it'll do every database, every collection. You can restrict it to certain collections. And then the opposite of that would be restore. The query parameters, so there's find and modify, update, remove. They all take a couple parameters. The first one would be a JSON document that you want to match on, and the second one, and they're both optional. If you include nothing, you'll get everything. If you want to match on documents, you include that, and then the second document would be fields that you want to include. So the first example up there just matches exactly on a field value, so if the available field is true. And then the second two examples show if you only want to return the name field or if you want to hide the name field. The ID field will always be returned unless you specifically say you don't want it. And then rather than just matching on an exact value, the matching document can also have a document for what you're matching on. There are certain operators, the $sign, that let you do comparisons. You know, if something's in an array, things like that. And then also querying on sub-documents. The second example here shows you just use a dot notation to get from nested fields in a sub-document. The pretty command at the end just formats it with white spacing, otherwise it'll come back with no spaces. And then you can also use JavaScript in the shell. So if you want to load an object and perform commands on it and update it, it's a little easier sometimes than writing a query that updates. When you're writing update queries, you also have the option of matching one or updating all the matches. There's also an option for upsert, which means if it doesn't find it, it'll insert it. Indexes by default are created only on the ID field. You can create them on any field by typing in ensure index, and then 1 or -1 for if you want it sorted alphabetically or reverse. And then when you run a query, if you put explain at the end, it'll give you more information than what I have shown here, but it'll tell you if you see a B tree cursor, then you know it used an index. The indexes are all saved as B trees. And then the number of scanned objects. So this query returned 3 objects, and it only scanned 3 because I only queried on something that was in the index. And then you can also query for the indexes on a collection and see the default ID in the one I created. And then obviously the more indexes you have, it'll slow down your writes but increase your reads. And then ease of development is something that's really nice with Mongo. So I'll show a simple example. And in regards to the dynamic schemas, you're allowed to put anything you want into a document, but that doesn't mean you want to do that. It can be difficult to work with if you don't know what's in there or if things are stored differently. But here's a simple example just showing an object with a couple of nested objects. There's a C# driver, makes things really easy. I also use a package called Mongo repository that implements repository pattern on top of things. So instead of writing 4 lines, you basically have to write 1. But an entity would be something that you're storing in a collection that would have an ID. And then if you want to have typed subdocuments that wouldn't be in their own collection, then those are not entities. But you just define the fields as they appear, and if you're using dynamic schema and you don't know how they are, you can write custom serialization, or you can return things in binary JSON and then work on them. But it's easiest if you know how they're going to be. So in this case, you define the subdocument and the main one, and then it's as easy as 1 line of code to use link to query the collection, get what you want, and then that's what it looks like in your object model. Any questions?
Thanks, Mike. So yeah, unfortunately, as we'll see, when you get Sitecore adds a few layers of abstraction between you and Mongo, so it's not quite as easy as using the C# driver here. But if you're doing something outside of Sitecore and you're looking for a quick data store, just as a total non-Sitecore tangent, Mongo is a great way to easily define some data, stick it in a database, and get it back out without having to worry as much about what the schema is or creating the database fields and so on. And as we'll see too, though, one nice thing about the fact that Mongo has this dynamic schema and the ability to create the indexes on the fly is that you just really have to turn on Mongo and point Sitecore at it. You don't have to restore databases or do any other configuration within Mongo. Sitecore just sees Mongo and it starts creating necessary collections and and indexes. So that all being said, it's still a pretty complex architecture when you go to deploy the xDB. So, I mean, you can do a very minimal architecture. You can see on the left, you have on the same server, you have Sitecore, you have Mongo, and SQL Server. You can run them all together for development purposes. And that's what I'll be showing you in a minute here. As with your standard Sitecore content management functionality, you can start to separate things kind of vertically as well. So as today, you can separate your content management and content delivery servers. You can split the obviously you're going to want to split the SQL Server database onto its own server in anything but a development environment. You can split the Mongo onto its own database for session and potentially another one for collection if need be. And then processing and reporting can run on independent Sitecore instances as well. All the way on the right, you can get into the super awesome horizontally scaled scenario where you have multiple content delivery servers within multiple data centers, and each with their own separate session databases that are pulling back into a single MongoDB collection server experience database, which, as Mike noted, you can horizontally scale that as well through sharding and replication sets. And then you can have multiple processing servers if you really have that much data, and scale those horizontally all back into the reporting database, where at that point you are limited to SQL servers, sort of difficult horizontal scaling, or just the usual procedure of throwing a bunch of memory and processors at it. So if all this is too scary to you and you don't want to touch Mongo database, Sitecore kind of foresaw that, and they've already announced, and we'll be talking more about soon, their awesome xDB cloud offering, cloud aka the internet. But the idea is that you can have a fully managed reporting and data collection infrastructure offered by Sitecore, so that you don't have to worry about that yourself. You don't have to worry about scaling it. You don't have to worry about maintaining it. In theory, you buy it, you tweak a couple configuration files, and you're ready to go. The idea is for it to be of reasonable cost, very likely much more reasonable than running your own collection infrastructure. Obviously high SLA and global availability, and also with some options for non-production access, so you can still do all your development against it without impacting your production data. And I believe they'll be running all of this actually on Microsoft Azure. So again, it allows you to scale without needing to manage that complex infrastructure. The pricing is actually going to be based on the number of contacts you have stored within the xDB, not based on any kind of traffic or bandwidth. And simple configuration, I won't be showing this today, but it is really just enabling a configuration file and entering in your license key. What I don't know is what your options are for extending the reports. One of the cool things I'm going to show you in a bit here is how you can extend that processing and that aggregation so that you can create your own reports from the collection database. And I don't know, obviously in any kind of SaaS model you lose some of that extensibility and configurability. So, well, let's actually get into some code and real demos here. And I don't have any offerings to the demo gods other than maybe some pizza, but I don't think they eat pizza. But let's start with the basics. So when you're first configuring the analytics, you're obviously going to need to set up some connection strings. You need to install Mongo, as Mike pointed out. Configure your session state store. One thing that I found out the hard way is that you don't want to override the global ASAX. Or if you do, you want to inherit from the sitecore.web.application class. And that's because, anyone? Why would Sitecore need global ASAX? Session end, thanks Jason. Have some headphones. Yes, so session end event, Sitecore needs to be able to trap that. And apparently this has been a requirement in Sitecore for a couple of versions now, but apparently for no functionality that I was using. And then just as with analytics today, you need to make sure to have that SC visitor identification tag on your main layout. And what this does is inject a little bit of code there that lets Sitecore determine whether you're a robot or not. I assume by running some JavaScript or something like that. So if you don't put that on there, Sitecore is going to think everyone visiting your site is a robot, and you're not going to see any analytics data. And then for developing and testing only, this is one big annoyance that I've yet to find a workaround for, and that's you need to turn down your session expiration, because otherwise you're going to be sitting there for 20 minutes waiting for Sitecore to flush that data to the experience database before you see it. So I have mine set right now to 2 minutes. It would be nice if there were just like a button to say flush sessions. So that's going in as a feature request. So let's take a look at all that stuff quick. And I'll try to zoom the text here for you guys. So connection strings.config got much bigger. There we go. And you see we have our traditional core master web, but then we have a bunch of Mongo databases. Analytics is the main one here. That's the experience database. You have some other ones that you really don't have to worry about that Sitecore uses for processing and tracking of automation data. And then you have reporting, which is now your SQL Server reporting database. And as I mentioned before, you also have the secondary reporting that Sitecore uses while it's rebuilding all that and reaggregating all that data for you. And then I also have my session database here, which in this case I'm using the MongoDB session store. So connection strings.config blew up. But the thing to know is that really you're still only installing 4, maybe 5 SQL Server databases instead of you're not having to actually set up each of these Mongo databases explicitly, because Mongo is smart enough to create each of these the first time you attempt to use them. And then also to create all the collections and the indexes within them as needed. And then if we take a look at our web config, you can see I have my session state set to custom, and a custom provider is Mongo. And again, this is what Sitecore has provided, the MongoDB Mongo session state provider. And you can also see available here the Sitecore SQL session state provider. Honestly, haven't dug into this, but I assume for this one you would have to create the database and install the appropriate schema in order to use that. Probably very similar to using the Microsoft provided SQL session state database. And you can see I have my timeout turned down here as well. If you're doing this in development, don't forget to turn that back up before you go to production, or you're going to have some very unhappy shoppers. And what else did I want to show you guys here? So visitor identification is quickly, if you aren't familiar with this, you can see in the head of my page here I've added the SC visitor identification tag, run at server. That's all you need to do. I believe there's a similar HTML helper for Sitecore MVC. So that's the basics. Remember global ASAX, because I lost about 2 days to that. So the next thing to note is that there have been some changes to the Sitecore Analytics APIs. I'm guessing based on the hands raised earlier that most of you guys haven't needed to work directly with Sitecore Analytics APIs much. But it used to be that you basically did everything through Sitecore.analytics.tracker. You call, much like Sitecore.context, you'd access static methods, static properties on the tracker. Now you are going to need to go a level deeper for everything in that Sitecore.analytics.tracker.current. And this allows Sitecore to inject different implementations of the tracker, and also to potentially, from what I can see, switch trackers in the middle of a session. I'm not sure what value that provides, but I'm sure it helps them with unit testing. So to show you guys some of the changes here, so what I've actually done that you guys are going to see is we did basically a proof of concept integration of ActiveCommerce, our Sitecore e-commerce plugin, with Sitecore 7.5. So as part of that, I had to upgrade a number of the calls to Sitecore Analytics. So for example, we have a MVC controller that allows us to basically log virtual page URLs into Sitecore Analytics. And so to do that, whereas before we would call tracker.currentpage.url equals a value, now it's tracker.current.currentpage.setURL. To cancel tracking is now not just tracker.currentpage.cancel, tracker.current.currentpage.cancel. I'm guessing you guys are already seeing the pattern. And then another piece of what we do is Sitecore Analytics has the concept of engagement value on a visit. So the basic idea is to track the quality of the visit based on a scoring system. In e-commerce scenarios, we like to make that simple and just say if you purchase something, we're going to add the value of that item you purchased to your engagement value. So now to do that, instead of tracker.currentvisit.value, you're accessing tracker.current.interaction.value. So tracker.current.contact is going to be your typical way of getting at data around the contact, that shared session data. Tracker.current.interaction is usually where you're going for the current page and the interactions within that private session. So I believe we'll see a bit more interaction with the tracker as we go. For the most part, the thing to know is that if you have existing analytics calls and you're going to need to upgrade them, for the most part, it should be pretty trivial. It's not like there's been a major restructuring of the APIs. You're just kind of having to go a bit deeper into the API or go to a slightly different place to get at the same data. So the next step here, we're tracking data. We have the things we had previously in Sitecore Analytics, which is visits and visitors. Now we actually want to take advantage of that contact. We want to be able to track someone across their devices or after they clear their cookies. So to do this, you have to do what's called identify the contact. And there is a simple API call, again, a bit buried, Sitecore Analytics Tracker current session.identify. And then you pass in the string that identifies the user. Could be a username, could be an email, could be a user ID if you have one. But you need to make that call to identify. So where can you do this? You could do it on login. You could do it on form submission. And in fact, there's going to be a version of Web Forms for Marketers for 7.5 that does some of this for you. And or obviously you could do it on some transaction like an e-commerce order. So the thing that happens then, though, is that I might have been browsing the site already, having all this activity, and then I identify, and suddenly I have an existing contact record. So I have an anonymous contact, as Sitecore calls it, and then a known contact. And that data has to get merged. So what happens there is magic. And I think this is one thing that Sitecore is still working on, and there's definitely going to be a pipeline for you to manage this, because this can get complex, right? Obviously, for things like page views, no big deal. But if, in one place I've said my name is Nick, and in the other I've said my name is Nicholas, which one are you going to accept? And you probably need to make some decisions as to whether the known contact data or the anonymous data is going to take precedence. So this is my get out of jail free card later, because there's some issues with one of my examples around this. But first, let's take a look at this in code. There's not much to view quite yet, because just having an identified contact doesn't buy you a whole lot other than the data. But so in ActiveCommerce, we have something called a customer manager, and this is our entry point for doing any kind of login or data updates for customers. So if I look at my login function, if I can get my scroll to work here. So we do kind of a standard Sitecore login. We get the user's full Sitecore domain username here, so that would be extranet / my username. Then we call Sitecore Analytics current session identify, and here I'm using the email as my unique identifier. So not too bad, one line of code that I had to add here. And then the other place we've added it. So in Active Commerce, we also have the concept of what we call our order processing pipeline. If you're used to working with pipelines in Sitecore, the idea is that you can modify a lot of Sitecore's activities and processes by just patching in additional classes or objects that it should run. And the same applies to order processing in our commerce platform. So here, part of what I have available to me during my order processing is that customer's email address. So even if that customer thinks they're being sneaky and uses guest checkout, guess what? I still got them. So we got their email address, we can track them against their previous interactions, and we can be all Amazon creepy. So, but then the result of that is that in Sitecore Analytics data, I'll start to see my all of my data being aggregated under a single contact. So Mike was showing you the scary MongoDB command line interface. There are some nice GUI interfaces too. If you're like me and you're a little more comfortable being able to click and right-click and look at data on a white background. I know you can configure it to have a white background in the command line too. But, so in this case, we have our Mongo collections here, including the contacts and interactions. And that's our 10-minute warning. No. So for contacts, I have 3 contacts here, and most of them are anonymous. But we can see my contact here with my personal information. And then in the interactions database, we can see the visits. And so here we have a contact ID on the visit, and we can see the pages that were visited and any events that were triggered as well, including things like page errors and all the standard Sitecore Analytics events. So because I've identified myself as a contact, now Sitecore is aggregating all that visit data under myself as a single contact. And in fact, even though it's only half working, I can show you guys that this also is going to manifest itself in the Experience Manager. So if you guys aren't familiar with Sitecore Speak, this was a new UI framework they added in Sitecore 7.1 for creating sort of more targeted applications or business operations in Sitecore. So for reporting, order management, email campaign manager, all these things that a user of a particular role is going to want to do without having to see the whole mess of Sitecore Desktop or Content Editor. So the experience profile is built on Speak, and you can tell that mostly just by the fact that it has this new sort of UI framework, this new user experience. So if we look in here, we saw those 3 visitors in the database before, and here I am as an identified user. And unlike the fancy marketing example, I'm not going to have a picture of myself or all my personal information in here yet, but you will be able to see my overview. You're going to be able to see the last time I visited the site, the average value of each visit, the total number of page views I've had. I can look at each of these visits and dive into them and see the specific pages I looked at. And then as well, I don't know if I'm going to have any profiling data. No, if I had any profiling data in terms of profile cards that I adhered to, that would show up here as well. Again, if you're on a large B2C website or other marketing site, probably not that valuable, unless maybe you want to do some sampling of particular users. But in a B2B scenario, or a customer support scenario, it can be really powerful to log in and actually see the user's activity. So let's start to do some cool stuff now with the fact that we've identified this contact. And this, to me, I think is probably maybe has more potential use than Sitecore even realizes, the concept of shared sessions. So take the whole analytics picture out of it. Just the fact that functionally I can browse a website and have my session and then go to my phone and be on the same session is a pretty cool idea, especially in this day where we're probably jumping around different devices throughout the course of the day. So any data stored on the contact itself can be accessed or updated from multiple browsers and devices simultaneously, obviously provided the user's been identified. So the easiest way to do this is with the attachments property. And this is just a dictionary that you can use to store with a string key and any object a value on that contact. So to do this, to take a look at this, let me make sure I'm on the right version of my code. So in Active Commerce, we store the shopping cart in the session by default. And obviously, if we were building from the ground up and we wanted to use this, we'd just store the shopping cart within that attachments property. But instead, as kind of a quick POC, what I've done is Sitecore has a pipeline that it runs at the start of the request called Start Analytics. And then at the end of the request, after the page is run and any logic with that, it calls a pipeline called End Request. So what I've done is in Start Analytics rather, I'm going to pull that cart out of the contact attachments and set it as my current shopping cart. And then at the end of the request, if there have been any changes to that shopping cart, or even if there haven't been, I'm going to, within that attachments property on the contact, I'm going to throw the cart back into there. So we're keeping the cart in sync between the shared session and the private session, essentially. So I'll do a build here, and we can actually see this in action just across different web browsers. And you'll have to bear with me because this is a large project. It'll take a second to reload. If I thought ahead, I would have had something smart to talk about while this was reloading, but instead, you all are going to have to wait. In the meantime, I have Firefox, and I have a separate anonymous session in Chrome over here. So right now, my cart is empty, not signed in. I'll go ahead and sign in within Firefox. And you guys saw the code just before that when I sign in, it's going to identify me within Analytics as well. And now I'll go ahead and add some product to my cart. So this blue snowshoe looks nice. And now if I go over to Chrome, not logged in, my cart suddenly has something. Probably because even though I'm logged in already, here, let me start a fresh session. Sitecore's probably already identified me because I have a cookie. So not logged in, nothing in the cart. Now if I go ahead and again log in, and thank you, demo gods. I probably lost my session because it's set to expire in 2 minutes. One more time, I swear this will work. All right, empty and drum roll. There we go. Thank you, thank you. And so now back in Chrome, I add something to the cart here, and I get it again over in Firefox. So kind of cool. You can think of a lot of uses besides shopping carts for this, I imagine, whether I'm configuring a product, I'm filling out some long, arduous form that I want to finish on my phone, on the bus, or what have you. So that's cool. That attachments property, super easy to use. You can throw any object in there. Like, I guess one thing I haven't mentioned at all yet is that, like using SQL sessions in standard .NET, everything does need to be serializable. So you need to put that serializable tag on your objects. And the same applies to shared session data as well. So again, attachments super easy, but the thing with attachments is that these don't get actually pushed to that collection database by default. They aren't going to get persisted within the experience database. It's meant more for kind of, I think, transient shared session data. There is a submit contact pipeline. That you can use to persist that data if you like. But there are two easier options as well for extending that contact in ways that will actually get pushed to the collections database. So option 2 is called the extensions. There's a property on the contact object that allows you to store simple name-value pairs within the contact. So if you have straightforward data that you just want to persist with the contact, maybe process later, maybe access later, you can use contact.extensions. For a shopping cart, though, I need more than just some simple name-value pairs. I need more of an entity to store that. And for this, Sitecore has another property called facets. And this is very confusing because in Sitecore 7 they introduced in the search APIs the concept of faceted filtering, and you can search and narrow things on facets. These are not search facets. These are, I guess you could say, are facets of a contact or facets of an entity that you want to store. So to do this, unfortunately, again, it's not as easy as just using the MongoDB driver, but it's not too bad. We're going to first create an interface for the facet that's going to inherit from my facet and add our fields to that interface. We'll create an implementation which inherits from the facet class. And then there are some base methods on there that basically allow us to persist those various properties. And we'll see that in a second. If you have more of a composite object structure, your composite pieces of that facet are going to use IElement and element, much in the same way that you're using facet. Facet is actually a subclass of element. And then you actually, in an XML config, you need to register your elements and register the facet. But once you do all that, you can get at the facet with contact.getFacet, specifying the type and the string name, again, as we'll see in a moment. So let's take a look at that. And here I need to check out that code. And this time I'm going to do the smart thing and build and start Sitecore recycling while I walk through the code for you guys. So if we get that going. So let's take a look at our facet. So in this case, I'm trying to add a shopping cart facet, so I can actually persist the shopping cart Maybe I want to run reports on what that user has in their cart. Maybe if they don't complete their purchase in a week, I want to send them an email with a 10% off coupon. Or maybe I just want them to be able to come back later, log in, and get their cart. So we have our iShopping cart implements iFacet and adds a field for a coupon code that the user may have had and any shopping cart lines. And then the shopping cart line has a similar interface inheriting from iElement with a product code and the quantity. So collection of cart lines tells you all the products and how many of each. For the actual implementations of these classes, for the shopping cart, much like our session data needs to be serializable, and I inherit from Facet. And so what we're essentially doing in this class is telling Sitecore what the names of the properties should be in Mongo. So it's not as straightforward, again, as using that C# driver where it will do the mapping automatically. But so I have some constants here for my coupon code and shopping cart lines fields. In my constructor, I'm telling Sitecore, hey, make sure you have an attribute for that coupon code and a dictionary to store all the shopping cart lines. And then in my implementations of these properties, I'm just either getting or setting that simple attribute value here, or for the shopping cart lines, I'm getting a dictionary. So we're really just reading from this backing store that's available in the base class. And shopping cart line is very similar, where we have the product code and quantity, get attribute, set attribute in both the properties. So pretty straightforward to create these classes for whatever data structure you might need. Then to configure them, I'm patching in here, and we'll take a look at the full list, but we have a new configuration element under Sitecore for model, and it has elements and entities. For elements, I'm going to make Sitecore aware of the interface and implementation for both my entities here, the cart and cart line. And then for the contact, we're going to add a facet, which is the shopping cart. And here we just need to tell Sitecore what the interface of that facet should be. And I'm imagining behind the scenes it's resolving the correct implementation. So we can see here in the patched configuration, here's all the elements that Sitecore has built in already for things like the contact personal information, phone numbers, address, geo-IP data, phone numbers again, and then our added shopping cart data. And then you can see the facets actually accessible on the contact, personal information, addresses, emails, and so on. So for personal information, for example, back in that customer manager where we identified the user on login, we have another method which updates the contact's profile data right now within the Sitecore membership database. But I've added some additional logic here to get at that personal information based on its type and the name of the facet. And then from there, all I need to do is set the fields for first name and surname. And that's how I got my name within that experience profile we looked at earlier. And then now to persist my cart, instead of reading from attachments, it's a little more complicated. We're going to get that shopping cart facet, need a little bit of logic to clear out any existing data in the cart, but then we can read in that coupon code from the persistent cart. We can loop through the lines that have been persisted in there and add them to the shopping cart in the session. And then at the end of the request, we're going to do the opposite. We're going to grab the persistent cart, remove all the existing coupon codes and shopping cart lines, and then set the coupon code and reset the coupon code and all the shopping cart lines in the persistent cart. So in Mongo, that's what this ends up looking like. So I have my cart facet with the shopping cart lines property, and you can see 2 products in that shopping cart. If I go back here, and this is where I'm going to cheat a little bit, and before I log in, I'm going to make sure my existing session is all cleared out so we don't have to worry about merging with it. But now if I sign in, and I go to my shopping cart, we can see those 2 products that I had saved in my persistent shopping cart in Mongo. So obviously this using facets instead of attachments can be much more useful if you have data that you want the user to be able to come back to later. Is everyone still with me? Have I bored you all yet? Because I got one more example. So we've kind of been tracing our way through that new long, lengthy life cycle of data in Sitecore Analytics, from the shared and private session to the collection database, and now last thing we're going to talk about is the report data and extending that aggregated report data. So if, for example, I want to be able to report on how often particular products are added to shopping carts. And obviously, there's nothing built into the Sitecore reporting database for that out of the box. So if you want to extend the report data and add to those SQL tables, the first thing is you need something to aggregate. You need something to report on. I could go against the persisted shopping cart data, but that doesn't tell me about whether during a single request if a user added or removed particular stuff. So the first thing I'm actually going to do is register a new event in analytics for a user adding something to their shopping cart. And that way I'll have that event available to me when I want to process that data. And the next thing is that you need to create a new fact table. So if you recall, the fact tables actually store aggregated analytics for you to query against. And then you need to create some model classes that represent that table, both the unique key for that table and the values in that table. And then finally, as with most extensions in Sitecore, we're going to create a pipeline processor. And this time it's an aggregation processor that will register into the config. And when Sitecore is processing data, it will run our processor and we can output some data into our fact. So if I take a look at the Active Commerce Shopping Cart Manager, which is what you use to add and remove products to a shopping cart. What I've added here is when a product is added to the cart, we're also going to register a new analytics event. So you actually configure these within the content editor as well, and you can assign goal values to them and so on. But so this is the name as it's been configured in the content editor. For the data property, I'm going to pass in the quantity that was added to the cart. For the data key, I'm going to pass in the product code. And then I'm not even sure what text is used for it, honestly, so I just said added to shopping cart. So then I'm going to then register this event on the previous page. So because this is being called within a MVC controller, I'm actually going to say, hey, the previous page, the actual product detail page they were on, register this event for that page. So what that's going to do then is if I look in my analytics data, in my interactions, hopefully I can find one here. Here we go. So we'll see now within the page events collection on this page, add the shopping cart with the quantity and the product code. So to store this data in SQL Server, I've created a good old-fashioned SQL table. Again, total tangent, but the irony of this whole thing to me is that now I'm working in this new NoSQL technology, but also I have to go back and do what I usually don't have to do in Sitecore, which is create SQL tables. But I've created this table, fact product added. And for primary key, it actually has a key that crosses 4 fields, which is the product code, the date, the site name, and the contact. And then for a value, it has the quantity added to the cart. So obviously, this isn't going to give me an explicit aggregation of like products per cart ads per product. But the idea is that it's in a format that's easy for me to query, whether I want to get that data or whether I maybe want to find out that data specific to sites or within date ranges or so on. So it's not, you don't need to explicitly represent your report within these tables. It just needs to be optimized so you can easily run SQL sums or averages or whatever, excuse me, against this data. And then back in Visual Studio, I've created a fact class, and this very simply inherits from fact and specifies the key and value classes. The key is going to contain all my primary key fields. The value is going to contain my value, and it also has a static method that can reduce 2 values. And basically by reduce, this means, hey, if you have 2 values with 2 of these events within the same session, what's the value you actually want to store within the fact table? And in this case, we're just going to add the quantities together. So we'll see where this is used. Actually, I believe we already saw it. Yes. So in our fact, as part of our constructor, we're going to call the base constructor and actually pass in that function. So when you're processing all these events within a session, Sitecore is going to use this fact class to represent that data and then push it back into SQL Server. So, and you'll notice that the name of my fact matches the name of the table after the fact underscore, and that's really the only mapping you need to do there. So you just need to make sure that class name matches the name of your fact table. And then finally, I actually need to do the processing of this data. So again, this Sitecore is going to run this pipeline as it's doing within its processing service, as it's aggregating data from the collection database. And this is going to be, I think, processing essentially a single visit. So what I'm going to do is iterate over all the pages in that visit. I'm going to look for any events on each page that are add to shopping cart. And then I'm basically just going to construct my key and value classes based on data within that event. There's a little bit of trickiness to get the site ID with the helper method that Sitecore provides. But otherwise, I'm just populating the product code, the contact, the site, and the date within the key, the quantity within the value, and then I call fact.emit with the key and value, and that's it. Obviously, if you're adding new aggregations, you need to reprocess all the data because that aggregation wasn't there to process before. So we have a fun new utility page under Sitecore admin to add to the list, which is rebuild reporting database.aspx. And then I click start. Click start. And Sitecore would run through and process all the data. I don't know why it's not starting now. But that's great. That's fine because I have already done it ahead of time. And so we can see here I have 3 queries. You can see the data is actually in both my analytics database and analytics 2. Again, the idea here is while I'm rebuilding, there's something I can still run reporting against. Then I have a more complex query here that's basically totaling up all the product ads for me. So I can see for each product code, I do a little group by. That nice blue snowshoe is pretty popular, and some other products aren't as popular. What's not totally clear to me yet is then what's the best way to surface this new data within Sitecore UIs. You still have the old Stimulsoft reports where you could pretty easily use this query to drive some new reporting UIs. But I think ideally in Sitecore's mind, you'd be using the awesome new Speak framework and all its fancy graph and table controls to build the custom reports for what you need. So for example, for Active Commerce, we'd probably add some additional fact tables for things like order volume and so on, and then use Speak to build a custom reporting UI within that Speak launchpad. Thank God he's done. So that's probably more than you wanted to know about Sitecore 7.5 and what's coming. This is a whole new realm of APIs and things that we all need to learn about Sitecore now. And like I was saying at the start here, I think this is yet another sign that Sitecore development is going to start to get more and more specialized. So for you partners out there with larger teams, you're probably starting to think about, who's my Speak expert, who's my analytics expert, who's my, just my general site build out expert. Because again, it's a whole new set of APIs and really strategies you need to develop too at the start of an implementation. What facts and reports is your customer going to want when you're building out a new site? But cool stuff, and especially the fact that potentially we don't need to worry about the infrastructure anymore with the new cloud offering is also pretty nice. So thank you, everyone. We do have some Sitecore swag to hand out, but to do that first, I'm going to ask you guys to pass around those little rating sheets right there. This is our first event. We want them to be successful in the future. We want you guys to keep coming back, so please give some good feedback. And once you guys fill these out, we'll throw them all in a box, and we have some mouse pads and USB sticks and headphones to pass out from Sitecore.